Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into a topic that's, well, it's often debated, sometimes maybe feared, and definitely frequently misunderstood. China's unique economic model and its rapidly evolving place in the world. We've got a stack of source material here, basically excerpts from a recent book that really challenges some conventional thinking. And our mission is to cut through the noise, unpack the key insights, and get to the core of what's really happening.
Yes, right. We're going to try and explore the paradoxes of China's hybrid system, figure out what actually powered its astonishing growth, look closely at the lives and choices of ordinary Chinese people, and also examine that intricate relationship between the state and the private sector, tackle the challenges in its financial and property markets, appreciate its distinct approach to innovation, and finally, consider its expanding role in global trade and finance and what all of that means for you wherever you are.
Get ready for some, I think, surprising facts and a perspective that really moves beyond the headlines. Let's unpack this. So, when many of us in the West think about China, maybe some older images still come to mind. Perhaps a country that's technologically, I don't know, backward, with limited individual freedoms, and an economy totally dominated by the state. But right away, our source material today challenges those assumptions. It points to these, well, seismic shifts that have occurred, particularly since the late 1990s.
Absolutely. The material highlights that by the late 90s, there was this palpable public excitement. Think about it. You had debates around economic reforms, the bid for the Olympics, joining the WTO, the privatization of state companies, the rapid adoption of technology. This wasn't just abstract government policy. It was, woven into the fabric of everyday life.
Right.
And critically, living standards were improving dramatically. The source paints a picture of cities where the skyline could literally change over a single summer. It was that fast.
Wow. And that pace of transformation created a really striking contrast. The source reminds us that, yeah, just 30 years ago, the state did dominate the economy. But fast forward to today, and according to the material, the private sector now accounts for over 60% of national output, holds 70% of the nation's wealth, and provides a staggering 80% of urban employment.
It completely flips the script. And for many outside observers, this is where the mystery lies, right?
Yeah.
How does the Communist Party maintain its central role in an economy that increasingly looks and acts like a dynamic capitalist system?
Yeah.
How do you have such explosive entrepreneurial energy alongside a deep-seated culture of deference to authority?
It's a fundamental paradox. And the source makes it clear you can't really understand or even intelligently critique China's economy today if you're still operating under those old stereotypes. You have to grapple with this new China model, a system with incredibly intricate, often contradictory dynamics. It's not a simple label you can just slap on.
Exactly. And that's what we really need to dig into, the core features that define this hybrid system.
So what are the key characteristics that make this system so unique? The source lays out a couple of crucial features. The first one is this idea of strong state guidance at the macro, the big picture level, combined with vigorous market mechanisms operating at the micro or local level.
Right. Think of the central government as sort of setting the compass direction, outlining the national strategy, the major priorities, the big goals. But down on the ground, it's market forces, it's competition, and local governments that are actually driving implementation and economic activity.
And the source argues that this combination isn't just accidental, it's been fundamental to China's rapid growth. It helps explain those sudden spurts of technological adoption and even some historical economic conundrums we've seen, like a persistently undervalued exchange rate, low interest rates and wages, those massive trade surpluses.
Yeah, it's a system built for rapid mobilization towards national goals, but crucially, using market incentives to make things happen locally.
That makes sense.
What's fascinating here, though, is that the source points out the inherent tension this creates. Well, the state and market aren't always aligned. They can pull in different directions. And while this isn't presented as some kind of perfect blueprint for every country, there's definitely something to be learned from how this unique blend has functioned.
Okay, that's the first major feature. State guidance, macro, market mechanisms, micro. What's the second big piece that the source highlights?
The second feature described is the pairing of political centralization with economic decentralization. We touched on the local level earlier, but the source really emphasizes the role of local officials, the mayors, almost acting as effective equity stakeholders in their own jurisdictions.
Equity stakeholders. That's an interesting way to put it. How does that dynamic play out exactly?
Well, their incentives are tied directly to the economic success within their patch. By actively supporting good private companies, they help foster industrial clusters. which in turn boosts GDP, creates jobs, increases real estate values, generates more tax revenue. And all this local economic performance is crucial for their political promotion up the party ranks.
Ah, okay. So it's not just about following orders from the top. Local officials have a powerful personal and political motivation to see their local economy flourish. That link between local growth and political ascent is really quite distinct.
It is, and it challenges a common Western perception of Chinese state capitalism being solely about the central government propping up big, often inefficient SOEs, state-owned enterprises. The source highlights that the much more prevalent model is this intricate state-private collaboration happening at the local level. The material even mentions research on, I think it was 37 million firms, that reveals a deep, complex network of ownership connections between state agencies and private capitalists throughout the economy.
Yeah.
It's a much more nuanced picture than simple state control.
That really changes how you think about the relationship. Much more intertwined, like you said. Now, let's pivot to what actually powered China's incredible growth story over the past few decades. Many might assume it was simply due to massive capital investment, building all those factories, roads, and infrastructure. And yes, China has had an exceptionally high investment rate.
That's a common assumption, yeah, but one the source pushes back against. While capital investment was certainly important, the research cited in the material indicates that total factor productivity, or TFP, played an even more significant role.
TFP, okay, remind me. That measures how efficiently an economy uses its inputs, like labor and capital, right? Getting more output from the same resources.
Exactly, and this is crucial because, as the source explains, capital investment eventually hits diminishing returns. You can only build so many identical factories before each new one adds less and less to growth.
Right.
Productivity growth, however, allows an economy to get fundamentally better at producing things, more efficient.
So productivity is the real engine that can shift an economy onto a higher growth trajectory. And the numbers presented in the source for China's TFP growth are quite remarkable, aren't they?
They really are. China's average annual TFP growth between 1978 and 2007 was 3.92%, accelerating to 4.58% in the decade leading up to the 2008 financial crisis. That's 1998-2007.
And how does that compare?
But to put that in context, TFP growth in the U.S. over a much longer period, like 1870 to 2010, averaged closer to 1.6, 1.8%, and has been much lower more recently, maybe 0.4% between 2010 and 2018. Europe's TFP growth has generally been below 1%. Korea, during comparable stages of development, saw TFP growth around 3%.
Wow, those are significantly higher numbers for China during its peak growth phase. It suggests a fundamental improvement in efficiency, not just throwing money at things.
It does. That said, the source is also clear that broad estimates suggest a substantial decline in China's TFP growth since around 2009.
Okay.
So this is a critical challenge looking forward. You can't rely on efficiency gains from simply catching up forever.
Right. Sustaining growth requires continued innovation and boosting that productivity figure again. Makes sense. Let's shift gears now from the high-level economics to something much more personal, the people. Our source material spends time focusing on the Chinese consumer and household as key economic agents, highlighting how their behavior is often shaped by unique policies and cultural factors in ways that might surprise Western observers.
Yeah, and one of the most profound influences discussed is the one-child policy. It was initially implemented back in 1978, primarily for the Han majority in urban areas. While its stated goal was population control, the source shows its socioeconomic consequences were vast and often unintended, deeply impacting family structure, gender dynamics, saving habits, and the approach to education.
One of the big puzzles internationally has always been China's incredibly high household saving rate. The source notes it's consistently been over 30% of disposable income for the last couple of decades, compared to, single digits in most OECD nations. Why is saving such a defining characteristic?
Well, the material points to a combination of factors. Fewer children, partly due to the policy, could mean less day-to-day spending, freeing up income to save. Then there's also the deeply ingrained Confucian tradition of filial piety, the expectation that children will support their elderly parents.
Okay.
But perhaps most critically, the source highlights the lack of a robust, universal Social Security or pension system. People feel a strong need to save heavily for their own retirement, often relying on their one child as their future support network. There's an example in the material about the Dongguan strike, where workers were protesting underpaid social insurance contributions. That really underscores this insecurity.
And tied directly to that saving is an enormous investment in that single child's future, right? The source says Chinese households spend around 25% of their annual spending on education for their one child. That's significantly higher than the approximately 5% seen in the US.
It's a massive allocation of resources, yeah. It's driven partly by a pragmatic view that education is an investment, ensuring the child can earn a good living and provide future support, and partly by incredibly fierce competition. The source provides striking evidence. Only children are significantly more likely to pursue college-track secondary education compared to twins, who are apparently more often steered towards vocational training.
Really?
Yeah, the material describes this intense parental focus on education as almost a national pastime.
The source also discusses the gender imbalance, which is particularly noticeable in rural areas. How does that connect to saving behavior?
It's a fascinating link, actually. The absence of a traditional dowry system means families with sons feel compelled to save significant amounts for marriage payments, sometimes called a bride price. Conversely, families with daughters also save, often investing heavily in their daughter's education as a way to increase their bargaining power and ensure a better match quality in the marriage market.
So saving happens on both sides, but for different reasons related to marriage prospects.
Exactly. The material even mentions the importation of wives from other countries as a consequence in some regions where the imbalance is severe.
So policies like the one-child policy and cultural traditions have profoundly shaped family finance and dynamics. What about the generations growing up now? Are they different?
Oh, very different, according to the source. It highlights the distinct nature of the post-1980s generations. They grew up in a time of unprecedented abundance, shaped by the one-child policy. They have significantly more spending power than their parents and have embraced consumerism readily. The material characterizes them as generally less risk-averse, having not experienced the scarcity their parents did.
A completely different world for them.
Exactly. They're also described as having a stronger social consciousness, caring about issues like injustice and the environment. They're looking for purpose and happiness, not just wealth accumulation.
Interesting.
And importantly, the source notes a strong sense of national pride and a shift away from automatically looking to the West, focusing more internally on China's achievements and identity.
It's clear that understanding the individual and the household level is absolutely crucial for grasping the broader economic picture in China. We've explored the state and the private sector separately, but it's the complex, often dynamic dance between them that really defines China's unique model. The source delves deep into this relationship, starting with the historical role of state-owned enterprises, or SOEs.
Right. Historically, SOEs were much more than just businesses. They carried immense social responsibility, providing housing, healthcare, even schools for their employees. Cradle to grave, almost. They were also the key instruments for implementing national economic plans. The material notes that in 2008, during the global financial crisis, SOEs were directed to undertake massive stimulus spending, often regardless of immediate profitability, specifically to maintain employment and stability.
But alongside these state giants, the private sector has had this astonishing rapid growth. From almost nothing in 1990, it's become the engine of the economy, responsible for the majority of tax revenue, GDP, innovation, and urban employment, as we mentioned.
Yeah, and a pivotal moment recounted in the source is the story of Ning Guangju and his Fool's Melon Seeds business back in the early days of reform. His success, and particularly his decision to hire employees, sparked a national debate. There were concerns about capitalist exploitation that apparently reached the highest levels.
And this case was brought before Deng Xiaoping himself, the source says.
Yes, and Deng's crucial decision to allow Ning Guangju to continue operating was a powerful signal. It wasn't just permission for one business. It was an endorsement that private enterprise was not only permissible, but could expand. This anecdote really illustrates the leadership's evolving pragmatic stance.
The source also discusses the significant reforms of the late 1990s that restructured many SOEs, pushing them towards greater productivity and competitiveness. This, alongside the rise of the private sector, created what the source calls China's dual-track system.
This dual-track approach, where reformed SOEs coexisted and competed, or sometimes collaborated, with a rapidly expanding private sector, is presented as a deliberate alternative to the shock therapy privatization seen in Russia and Eastern Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Right, which had some pretty disastrous consequences in places.
Exactly. By managing the transition more gradually, China largely avoided the negative consequences that plagued those economies, such as the rise of oligarchs, widespread corruption, and deep social instability.
So it wasn't an immediate dismantling of the state sector, but a complex evolution where both state and private elements learned to operate within the system. It led to growth, but also created these unique dynamics we're talking about. Okay, building on that state-private dynamic, the source shines a light on the absolutely critical role played by local governments, particularly after the significant fiscal reforms back in 1994. Those reforms drastically reduced the tax revenue share going to local authorities and limited their ability to borrow directly.
Right? This created a major funding gap for local governments, who were still responsible for providing public services and driving local development. So the central government provided a key revenue alternative, the right to lease state-owned urban land. This quickly became their primary source of income.
Ah, so they made money by selling usage rights to land. And the source explains how this created a powerful set of incentives, didn't it?
Exactly. When a local government leases land, they are essentially selling a share in the future prosperity of that area.
Okay.
So to make that land more attractive and valuable for property developers and future residents or businesses, they have a very strong incentive to invest heavily in infrastructure, roads, utilities, schools, parks, you name it.
That's fascinating. So local governments became almost like venture capital partners or equity owners in urban development projects, working alongside property developers and using land revenue to fund the necessary infrastructure.
Precisely. And the source notes that especially after the 2008 global financial crisis, as the older export-oriented manufacturing model faced headwinds, real estate development became an even more dominant engine of local growth and revenue. It effectively took over the role manufacturing had previously played in driving local official incentives.
This really underscores why local officials had such powerful reasons to fuel the property boom then. Direct financial benefits from land sales and related industries, but perhaps even more importantly, their political careers were tied to hitting local growth targets and fulfilling central government mandates, like promoting industries such as electric vehicles, which the source mentions.
It's a unique, powerful system of local incentives that drove urbanization at an unprecedented pace and fueled the property market. But it also created significant reliance on land revenue, which we'll probably come back to.
Definitely. Now, let's look at the flip side, some of the significant challenges within China's financial system and its massive property markets. The source describes the financial system as turbulent and exciting, characterized by state paternalism and often non-conventional behavior from market participants.
Yeah, the stock market is a good example of this turbulence. The source points out the puzzling underperformance of Chinese companies listed on domestic exchanges compared to those listed overseas or even unlisted private firms.
Why is that? It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? You'd think listing at home would be better.
Well, the source suggests several reasons for this domestic underperformance. Things like poor management decisions post-listing, such as tunneling funds, basically moving money from the listed company to related parties or the pockets of owners, or acquiring unrelated businesses. The example of Evergrande expanding into areas like electric cars and even pig farming before its widely reported troubles is cited as an illustration of this kind of thing.
Right.
This lack of performance has historically encouraged many Chinese companies to list abroad, although geopolitical tensions are now creating pressure for them to delist from Western exchanges, which is a whole other issue.
And then there's the housing market, which has grown to immense scale but faces major stresses.
It's massive. Privatized only in 1997, it became the world's largest market in just 2 decades. But property prices are incredibly high relative to income. The source notes it can take around 40 years of income to buy a home in some major cities, compared to roughly 10 years in many other countries. And rental yields are also very low.
So if it's so expensive and yields are low, why have so many people been eager to buy? What's the draw?
The source identifies several powerful drivers. For decades, returns on bank savings and the domestic stock market have been very low, sometimes zero or negative in real terms after inflation.
Okay.
This makes potential equity gains from property seem much more appealing, even if it looks like a bubble. There's also the critical six-wallet phenomenon.
Six-wallet?
Yeah, basically the parents and both sets of grandparents pooling their savings to help the young couple with the massive down payment.
Wow.
And finally, strong social and marriage market pressures play a huge role. Owning a home is often seen as essential for getting married. The source cites survey data about mothers objecting to daughters marrying someone who doesn't own property.
What about the images we've sometimes seen of ghost towns or empty developments? Are those representative of a wider problem?
The source acknowledges that vacancy rates in some areas, particularly certain large cities, can be high, perhaps around 20% compared to maybe 3% in the U.S. However, it argues that the ghost town images can be misleading.
How so?
They may represent just a snapshot in a multi-stage urban development process where infrastructure and buildings are put in place before they are fully occupied. It doesn't mean they'll stay empty forever. The material also points out that the most cited examples were often regional issues, not necessarily representative of the entire country's market.
Still, the source suggests that the reliance of local governments on land revenue fostered a dangerous, too-big-to-fail mindset among developers and even residents, encouraging speculative behavior in the property market.
Yes, definitely. And the market faces future headwinds. An aging population, declining marriage rates, and a slowdown in urbanization compared to previous decades will likely impact future demand. Meanwhile, the state is clearly trying to engineer a deleveraging and reining in of the sector now.
The source also discusses the rise of shadow banking. What was that about?
This system grew rapidly outside the traditional, heavily regulated state banking system. It emerged partly as a way to circumvent rigid regulations, foster some financial innovation, and fill gaps left by the formal system, particularly in providing credit to private businesses, which often struggle to get loans from state banks, and supporting local government infrastructure projects, often off their official balance sheets.
But it came with significant risks, didn't it? More freedom, but less oversight.
Absolutely. The downside included increased financial risk, potential for fraud like Ponzi schemes, which cropped up, and its role in fueling a massive increase in China's total debt. The source notes that China's total debt surged to over 230% of GDP by 2014, with shadow banking playing a significant role in channeling funds, especially after the 2008 stimulus.
So the financial and property sectors are clearly areas of both incredible dynamism driven by underlying demand and these unique incentives, but also significant, complex challenges and risks. Let's turn now to innovation, a topic where Western perceptions might be incomplete. When we often think of innovation, we picture 0-to-1 breakthroughs, completely new inventions like the smartphone or the internet. But the source offers a broader definition and highlights where China's strengths truly lie.
Right. The material emphasizes one-to-end innovation, focusing on significant improvements, clever adaptations, and novel applications of existing technologies and business models. While not starting from scratch, this type of innovation can generate massive productivity gains and economic value. It's about making things better, cheaper, more accessible.
And China is described as being particularly adept at this one-to-N innovation. Can you give some examples from the source?
Yes. The source provides examples of companies that creatively applied existing technologies and developed new business models suited specifically to the Chinese market. Think of iKey with its in-video purchasing features, or Pinduoduo's combination of group buying and gaming elements to drive sales, or Meituan integrating a vast array of services, food delivery, hotel booking, movie tickets onto a single super app platform.
Right, things we don't necessarily see replicated in the same way elsewhere.
Exactly. These are innovations that significantly boost productivity and income for millions of people and businesses.
China's enormous domestic market seems like a huge advantage for this kind of innovation too, doesn't it? Just the sheer scale.
It's a critical competitive edge. The sheer scale provides a vast pool of data that companies like Tuqiao in news aggregation, Ctrip in travel, or the giants Alibaba and Tencent can use to rapidly learn, iterate, and optimize their products and services based on the behavior of hundreds of millions of users simultaneously.
And fintech is another area where China really surged ahead, driven by practical needs.
Exactly. It emerged to address gaps in the formal banking system. For instance, servicing small businesses using their digital footprint's transaction data, social connections as a form of collateral, like Ant's MY Bank did. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, the government was able to leverage mobile payment platforms like Alipay and WeChat Pay to distribute targeted aid quickly and efficiently to specific individuals or businesses.
But the source does acknowledge that China still lags in 0-to-1 fundamental technological breakthroughs compared to the West in some cutting-edge areas.
Yes, the source mentions areas like branded pharmaceuticals, the most advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment and processes, high-end medical equipment, or entirely new green energy energy inventions as places where the West still generally holds the lead in fundamental discovery.
And this gap is clearly a national priority for China now, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The source mentions China's deliberate juguo, or integrated whole nation scheme, approach. It's about mobilizing national resources to achieve breakthroughs in critical, what they call throat choking, technologies where they are dependent on others. The material draws a parallel to past successful national mobilization efforts, like the two bombs and one satellite program from decades ago.
So the source's perspective suggests it's not a simple case of one side being ahead in innovation overall, but rather different strengths. Perhaps the U.S. leading in foundational AI algorithms and hardware, while China excels in AI implementation and the application of massive data sets.
That seems to be the nuance the source is getting at, yes. Different types of innovation flourishing in different ecosystems.
Let's broaden the view now to China's place in the global economy. The source stresses China's unprecedented impact on global trade after joining the WTO back in 2001.
Yeah, it's hard to overstate that impact. China's share of global GDP more than doubled in a relatively short time. There was a massive shift of low-wage manufacturing work to China, and its export surge transformed global supply chains. The material frames this impact as a debate. Was it primarily an opportunity or a threat? Or maybe both?
And the source presents both sides, including the negative consequences felt elsewhere, particularly in the U.S. manufacturing sector.
Yes, the material cites estimates suggesting that maybe 2 to 3 million U.S. manufacturing jobs were lost in the early 2000s, directly due to increased imports from China. It notes that this impact disproportionately hit already vulnerable sectors like textiles, toys, and footwear. Although it also points out, importantly, that U.S. manufacturing employment was already declining due to automation and outsourcing before China's rise accelerated things.
Right, it wasn't the only factor, but for consumers the story was different, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Consumers around the world benefited significantly from lower prices on a vast range of goods. The source argues that this particularly benefited lower and middle-income households, who spend a larger proportion of their income on traded goods. So it effectively reduced real income inequality for them, even as manufacturing jobs were lost.
Okay. The material then gets into the thorny issues that continue to challenge global trade relations, things like state subsidies, restrictions on foreign investment, and technology transfers.
This highlights a fundamental tension within the WTO system itself. Different perspectives on what constitutes fair trade, particularly between advanced and developing economies. Historically, the source notes, developing countries have often used measures like subsidies and selective opening up to protect their nascent industries. It points to the historical paths taken by countries like the UK, the US, Japan, and Korea themselves during their development phases.
So, there's a historical precedent argument there. And the source acknowledges that the current WTO system has flaws and needs updates, but getting major players like the US and China to agree on those updates is a significant challenge.
It is. The material also suggests steps China could take to foster better engagement. This includes things like acknowledging its status as a more developed economy in many sectors now, maybe phasing out SOE subsidies, which the source argues would also benefit China domestically by improving efficiency.
Right.
And consistently enforcing its own foreign investment law to prevent forced technology transfer, which has been a major point of friction.
There's an interesting concept mentioned here, Daobijiji or lock-in. What's that about?
Yeah, it's the idea that external pressure, say through the multilateral system like the WTO, can actually push China towards implementing reforms that are ultimately in its own long-term interest anyway.
How so?
Well, reforms like becoming more market-oriented and strengthening protection for intellectual property and innovation are seen as beneficial for China's own future growth. External pressure can sometimes help the reformers within China overcome domestic resistance and lock in those changes.
Interesting. And the source emphasizes that despite tensions, interdependence remains high.
Yes, very much so. Foreign direct investment still flows into China. The example of Tesla building a major plant in Shanghai is given. And foreign firms still view China as a vital fitness center, a place to sharpen their competitiveness, and obviously as a key market.
And the source argues that replacing China as a global manufacturing hub isn't easy, despite all the talk of supply chain diversification.
That's right. The source points to China's unmatched scale, its incredibly developed infrastructure and logistics networks, and, frankly, the relative ease of doing business there compared to many other developing countries. The material suggests that diversifying supply chains might involve enhancing engagement with China in certain ways, perhaps focusing on higher value segments rather than simply decoupling entirely, which might be impractical or too costly.
Okay, turning to financial dynamics, China's influence is also growing globally, not just in trade.
It certainly is. China is a major funder of infrastructure and renewable energy projects abroad through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative. And it holds vast amounts of U.S. Treasury debt, making it a key player in global finance. China clearly has ambitions to increase the international use of its currency, the renminbi or RMB, and potentially challenge the dollar's dominance over the long term.
How are they pursuing that?
Things like encouraging RMB invoicing for trade, attracting foreign financial institutions to operate in China, providing RMB liquidity to developing countries through swap lines. Its inclusion in the IMF's special drawing rights currency basket a few years ago was a symbolic step in this direction too.
But the source also points to a fragility in these global financial ambitions, doesn't it?
It does. It links it back to China's deep-seated preference for control over financial flexibility. Interventions designed to maintain stability, like managing the exchange rate tightly, can paradoxically trigger instability if market confidence wavers. The source cites the massive capital flight in 2015, where roughly $1 trillion left China in about a single year following changes to the exchange rate regime. That caused significant ripples in global markets.
So while China seeks to be a global financial player, its desire for control fundamentally hinders the openness and flexibility needed for its currency to become a truly global anchor, like the US dollar. Is that the takeaway?
That's the conclusion presented in the source, yes. Control versus flexibility is a key tension there. It also briefly touches on China's central bank digital currency, the ECNY, mentioning its potential benefits like efficiency, but also drawbacks like privacy concerns. Ultimately, the source notes that currency popularity relies on trust and underlying economic fundamentals, not just technology.
The source introduces a concept I found particularly interesting: China as a systemic emerging market. Can you unpack that?
Yes, it's a unique combination. China now has the size and global connections of a systemic economy, meaning events there can have significant ripple effects worldwide, similar to the US or the EU. But at the same time, it also retains many characteristics of an emerging market, including levels of volatility and risk in its financial system, its regulatory environment, and its growth path.
So globally important, but still with emerging market vulnerabilities.
Exactly. The source suggests this unprecedented combination makes China a potential source of future global economic shocks, something the world hasn't quite dealt with before on this scale.
It paints a picture of China's global role that's both incredibly integrated and still somewhat unpredictable. Let's wrap up by looking at governance and accountability within China, a topic often viewed very differently in the West compared to how it might be perceived internally. The source offers a perspective on why surveys consistently show high levels of citizen satisfaction with the government in China.
Yeah, the material links this to a combination of factors. First, the significant improvements in material prosperity over recent decades, which is undeniable for vast numbers of people. Second, a high level of perceived security and stability compared to previous eras or other parts of the world. And third, citizens apparently viewing the government as, in the source's words, attentive and responsive to their needs and concerns, at least on many practical matters.
And the source points to mechanisms of accountability that might not be immediately obvious from the outside, beyond just top-down directives.
That's right. Beyond the formal structures, the material highlights systems, like internal investigatory departments within the party, routine inspections of cadres, and targeted campaigns like the environmental inspections that have resulted in discipline for thousands of officials. Crucially, citizen complaint systems through traditional mailboxes, but increasingly via online platforms, are presented as vital information channels for the central government. They help leaders identify local issues and bypass potential cover-ups by lower-level officials.
So it's a different model of accountability than Western democratic systems, but the source argues it's not simply an unaccountable autocracy. There are feedback loops and pressures within the system.
Exactly. The source also discusses the state's strong policy agenda aimed at tackling income disparity. Income inequality has widened significantly in China over the reform period, almost reaching levels seen in the US from what was once a much more equal starting point.
And how is the state addressing that, according to the source?
The agenda includes setting specific targets for local governments related to poverty reduction and income growth. It also involves implementing measures like relocating populations from inhospitable areas, offering business incentives in poorer regions, and investing heavily in rural infrastructure and services like healthcare and education.
Despite intense anti-graft campaigns that have disciplined millions, corruption remains a persistent challenge, which the source notes underscores the immense scale of monitoring required in such a large system.
Absolutely. And that competitive dynamic among local officials we talked about earlier, the tournament for promotion while driving growth, can also lead to undesirable outcomes like local protectionism, where officials favor businesses within their own jurisdiction over those from elsewhere, hindering national market integration.
The source suggests that deep cultural roots of paternalism and a preference for control help explain the state's interventionist role in many aspects of life, from the economy to family size, and even things like regulating video game usage among youth.
And the material suggests this level of state intervention is broadly accepted by many Chinese citizens because it is perceived as delivering stability and safety, which are highly valued cultural priorities.
Looking forward, the source frames income inequality as a major challenge, impacting everything from educational opportunities to health outcomes. It's an issue that was highlighted and potentially exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, inequality is definitely flagged as a key vulnerability. The nature of state interventions, often described as Big Bang policy shifts, can also be a challenge.
How so?
While they can be effective in mobilizing resources toward a specific goal, the source notes they can also be suddenly dialed back or changed, creating uncertainty and harming predictability for businesses and individuals. This was seen, the source argues, with some unexpected policy shifts that contributed to the 2022 GDP slowdown and disrupted supply chains.
So this new playbook, as the source calls it, isn't static. It's a continuous process of the state attempting to find an equilibrium between potentially conflicting goals like achieving greater equality versus maintaining market efficiency, or ensuring national security versus fostering economic growth, or pursuing self-reliance versus remaining engaged globally.
It's an ongoing process of learning and recalibration, absolutely. And there's potential for missteps and setbacks along the way as they try to balance these often competing objectives.
Finally, let's bring this back to the global stage and the potential for cooperation in our increasingly networked world. The source makes a strong, perhaps counterintuitive point. Despite the political tensions, China needs the world, and the world needs China.
That interdependence remains significant, yes. As we discussed, FDI still flows into China because of its market size and manufacturing capabilities. Foreign firms continue to see it as a vital place to operate and compete, even with the challenges.
And this interdependence is perhaps most critical when facing shared existential threats, right?
Absolutely. Climate change, future pandemics, the potential displacement of workers by AI, these are global challenges that require global cooperation. The source argues it is essential for major powers like the US and China to find space to collaborate on these issues. It points to China's massive investments in clean energy as an area with potential for shared progress, despite competition elsewhere.
Maintaining connections, whether through trade, academic exchange, or cultural links, is also emphasized as vital for mutual understanding, especially when political relations are strained. Keep those channels open.
Yeah, the source introduces a compelling idea of economic leadership in this networked age. It argues it's not just about a country's currency power or financial might anymore. It's also about its ability to enable networks, foster complementarity between different economies, and sustain an architecture where many can prosper together.
On the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, the source pushes back against the common narrative of debt traps, offering alternative perspectives from the material. What does it say?
Well, the source notes that most debt owed by BRI partner countries isn't actually owed to China. It points out that outright asset seizures have been rare, despite some high-profile cases discussed in the media. It also argues that China has often shared risks with borrowers, for example, by financing equity stakes rather than just providing loans, and that China has participated in G20 efforts to suspend debt payments for low-income countries. It presents a more nuanced, less purely predatory view than often heard.
Okay, a different perspective there. The material contrasts what it describes as China's pragmatic approach to engaging with developing countries with what the source sees as legitimacy challenges for the U.S. globally, sometimes stemming from nationalism and shifting international commitments.
The core conclusion here seems to be the necessity of finding a way towards peaceful accommodation between the U.S. and China. Recognizing their mutual aspirations, understanding that neither is likely to simply displace the other entirely, and acknowledging that finding areas for collaboration on global challenges isn't just beneficial, it's necessary for everyone's future.
So, what does all of this mean for you, listening in? We've taken a deep dive into China's economy, pulling insights from the sources provided.
We've seen a system full of fascinating paradoxes. Strong state power, deeply intertwined with dynamic private vitality. Central control balanced by decentralized local initiative and incentives. Deep-seated paternalism coexisting with vibrant entrepreneurial energy. We've seen incredibly high saving rates alongside a new generation of eager consumers, and ambitious innovation that blends adapting existing tech with a determined push for fundamental breakthroughs.
We've looked at the remarkable growth story and how it happened, the role of productivity, the unique incentives. But we've also acknowledged the price paid and the significant challenges from inequality and debt to environmental concerns and geopolitical tensions that lie ahead, both within China and globally.
Ultimately, understanding this complex playbook requires setting aside assumptions and really looking closely at the intricate, often contradictory dynamics at play. It's far more than just economic policy. It's about culture, governance, individual choices, and the collective decisions of billions of people.
So here's something to maybe mull over after this discussion. In a world increasingly defined by interconnected networks and shared global challenges, can the inherent competition between major powers like the US and China evolve beyond a simple win-lose struggle? Can it become, perhaps, a form of competitive collaboration, allowing humanity to tackle critical issues like climate change and future pandemics faster and more effectively, as the source suggests is necessary?
That's a compelling question to ponder. Definitely. Where does competition end and collaboration begin when facing global threats?
Indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.